Hey everybody, Professor Plunkett here. Just completed grading your week one assignments. So I did as I promised, kept within the 7 day framework of trying to get your work back to you within 7 days from the due date. That gives you the opportunity to go in and review the submission comments and my feedback so that if there are things that are issues in your assignment that you could then make corrections or updates to the assignment that you're about to submit, you still have the opportunity to do that. Now, I also did a special thing. I see one person already submitted the week two assignment, but I did do something last week and I updated it that allows you to resubmit your assignment before the due date. So Turnitin has some different settings that I can use. And one of them is to allow students to, one, see the Turnitin report, which tells you if any or what amount of your assignment appears to have been copied from sources, which of course is not acceptable. And we try to keep it to a minimum for those numbers. There's some things that are just going to show up. Like when you copy and paste the question that came out of the assignment, everybody should be doing the same thing. So everybody who picked the same questions as you did is going to have that question in their assignment. And everybody who did it in the class that I ran in September did the same thing. So those things will come up as appearing to be copied. That's okay. What's not okay is if parts of your answers are copied from, say, whatever source that you were using, whether it be the textbook, something else that you found. And I was really impressed that some of you found some really good sources to discuss the basic issues about crime, criminology, and some of the terminology from this week's questions, which I want to take a quick look at and review some of them with you, because obviously everybody doesn't come to the live session, so I can't really do that with you in the class during the week. And since grading is within 7 days and our live session for the next week might be already completed, that's also tough. So we did our live session on Monday. Actually, that was our live session was canceled because of Martin Luther King Day, so we didn't talk at all. But I hadn't even looked at any of your assignments yet because they were due the night before. So if anything, we could talk about them at our week three meeting, which then is like we're talking about week one stuff in week three, but it's going to help you to learn. But I want to look at it right now because there were some things I wanted to clarify. So let me share my screen. All right, screen one, share. Let's change this so you can't see the whole world. Um, all right, so somebody just added. We actually had a student that was added late to the class and wasn't even on the roster until like today, and they are trying to catch up, which is great. Hopefully they can get in line and catch up by the end of the week. Although your week two assignments, of course, keep in mind are due on Sunday. Okay, so we got a new announcement in here. This is actually a video on doing research and finding truth, which I think is very important for you in studying criminology, because criminology is all about doing research and trying to find out what's going on with crime and criminals. That's the main job of criminologists, is doing that research. And of course, some teach, many teach and do research at the same time. Some of your academic criminologists are in schools that require them to continuously do research while at the same time they're teaching. So I wanted to look at just the week one assignment and the questions there and hit on a few of the questions based upon which ones that most of the class answered. It seemed that a lot of people picked the same ones, the same basic ones, even though there were 8 questions to pick from and you had to pick 4. So, and I can't look at any individual's assignment because you can't have the whole class seeing other people's assignments. So anyway, the questions. Number one question was, what is crime? Who determines what, and is what is not criminal, and how are such determinations made? So that's a question I think almost everybody asked. I think some people just looked at 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, let me do them. Although nobody did 4. I guess 4 maybe that was just like too heady for you. I don't know, but I want to look at that. All right. So what is crime? Well, crime generally, and I'm sure it says this in your textbook, crime is defined by the legislature or the government. And some folks would say that without law there is no crime. So crime are acts that have been deemed to be detrimental to society, and so detrimental or so bad that the legislature determines that they should be illegal. Now, many of you mentioned the different levels of government. So you have the local, state, and the federal level. In some places, they actually have, you have a county level as well, although counties don't tend to make a lot of laws. But if you live, for example, in the city of Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia has a multitude of ordinances, which may or may not rise to the level of a crime, but you could still wind up with fines or other problems based upon those ordinances. Maybe parking. Parking isn't criminal, but if you violate, say, the parking meter, or you park where there's a sign that says you can't park, that's breaking the law in the city of Philadelphia. Now, some places would refer it back to a state statute. So like in New Jersey, where I work, there is a specific state statute on parking. And if the city were to place a sign about parking, usually it would refer back to the state statute, but they can also create their own. So, but crimes generally, and most of the crimes that you hear about are based upon state law. So most of your criminal law is at the state level. So, murder, obviously the big one. And then assaults, aggravated assault, sexual assault, robbery, burglary, car theft, just larceny theft. All those ones, if you looked at the list of what is counted by the UCR, all those crimes are generally appearing at the state level. Some of them, very few of them, as a matter of fact, appear at the federal level as well. But the federal level has a whole nother raft of crimes. And a lot of it overlaps, like the relatively new field of cybercrime. The laws are still trying to catch up with the technology. And there are federal statutes, and there are now some state statutes, and some of that overlaps and says almost the same thing. But depending upon who investigates, you're going to be dealt with in the state or the federal system. Now, another good example is robbery. Robbery is a violation of state criminal law in every state in the country. But it is also a violation of federal law if the place that is robbed is a federally insured facility. So if you rob a bank, you commit both a state and a federal crime. And in many cases, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will investigate the bank robbery. And another good reason for that is a lot of times people who are bank robbers, many of them will continue to rob banks until they get caught. It's not usually a one-off. I haven't done the research on that, but for the most part, bank robbers tend to do multiple jobs, even if it's only 2 or 3. I mean, there was a guy when I was a police officer in my town who was actually a Philadelphia teacher, which was really wild, who decided to rob a bank because he couldn't afford to pay his mortgage. So he figured he'd rob his bank. I think that was actually a one-off. So that was like a unique one-off situation where somebody was desperate. So when you think of causes of crime, this guy was desperate. He couldn't pay his mortgage, couldn't support his family properly for some reason, even though he was making whatever Philadelphia teachers made at the time, which is like, this is like 25 years ago. But he wound up being charged at the federal level, and he went into federal prison for like 5 years for the bank robbery. So crime, the basic answer to crime is that it is a violation of law, of criminal law. And who determines it? It's the legislature. And generally, for most of us, that's the state legislature, but also there are crimes that are determined at the federal level. And sometimes how the determinations are made, I don't think a lot of people really got into this in depth. But the determinations are sometimes made if there's an outcry in a community that this just keeps happening and there's no law, like cybercrime. Some of the cybercrime, when it started to happen, there really wasn't something you could prosecute somebody for. And when I was an officer, one of the issues that we had is if there was a guy who was a peeping Tom and he was looking into your window while you were changing at night, there was not a law that made that illegal. If you got your drapes open and the guy's not standing on your property, he's standing like on the sidewalk or something, and he can see inside, that wasn't illegal. So, but then they later on came out with stalking laws. Stalking laws were created in the last 30 years. Stalking law. So if you had a guy standing outside peering in the window, you could potentially charge him under the stalking law. One officer that I worked for got creative one time because the guy was actually right up at the window where he could actually touch the window. So they charged him with attempted burglary, suggesting that he was trying to break into the place. I don't think that flew in the courtroom, but it was creative. Because most people would think that, when we talk about the next question, that a peeping Tom is a deviant person. But like I said, at the time, there was no crime. So look at this, rolls right into question number 2. Question number 2 is, what is deviance, and how do we know what is and what is not deviant? Well, that's the second question is much harder than the first one. But what is deviance? Deviance is generally something that's a violation of the social norms and mores, and what does society believe is right or wrong. And sometimes it's certain parts of society. What is acceptable by say the majority of society. So someone used an example of 100 years ago it was deviant if a woman wore pants, and now it's generally acceptable. Today it might be somebody has a gauge in their ear, and if you're those of you who don't know what a gauge is, it's like when you take this skin part at the bottom of your ear and you put a hole in it, just like those of you that wear earrings. But a gauge is it's like a circle with a hole in it that you put in that spot. Or maybe a nose ring. Some people might think that's deviant, where they're getting more and more commonplace. Tattoos used to be considered deviant. Different types of behavior, like the LGBT community would be considered deviant at some point in some place. If you remember back in the 70s, the Stonewall riots that they talk about is because of issues in New York City where, police were harassing lesbian and gay people in that community. Actually, it turns out that one of the people that was involved in that was actually a transgender person, believe it or not, way back in the 70s, because those people aren't new either. But that's also something that certain people may consider deviant. So it kind of also depends upon your perspective. Somebody also used a really interesting example of deviant behavior is wearing a bathing suit into the supermarket, where there's nothing illegal about it as long as you're covering certain body parts, which if you expose them, then it's illegal. There's no problem. But somebody might consider it deviant. But I thought of another thing is wearing a bathing suit in the supermarket might be considered deviant, if you're in a supermarket, say in Philadelphia or here in my part of South Jersey. But what if you're down the shore and you walk from the beach to your rental property and there's a supermarket on the way and you happen to be wearing your bathing suit? It's probably much more common, and it's not considered deviant. So deviant sometimes is in the eye of the beholder. Is what is generally acceptable in society and what is not generally acceptable in society. That's deviance. How do we know? Sometimes it's really hard to know what is and what is not deviant. Now, there are some things that everybody thinks is deviant, but for some reason they're not illegal, or a majority of people would think is deviant. So say a 60-year-old man dating a 21-year-old girl. A lot of people would think that is deviant, but it's not illegal. So, that's the kind of things we're talking about. All right, how does delinquency differ from crime? Now, this is one that a lot of people did, but some people got a little bit confused as to what it actually is. Most, and I think your book defines it this way, although I think the PowerPoints might be a little bit off. But generally, delinquency, the term delinquency, refers to those acts when committed by a juvenile, and usually that's somebody under the age of 18, that are considered criminal if committed by an adult. So when a juvenile, somebody 16, 17 robs a 7-Eleven, that's a delinquent act. When the 18 or 19-year-old robs a 7-Eleven, it's a crime. It's the same act, but we put it in a different category because of the age of the offender. Now, and we're not talking about this in this particular assignment, but when you get to the point where you're deciding whether you're going to charge a juvenile as an adult, then you're basically saying, okay, we're not going to call their act delinquent anymore. We're going to call it a crime because we're going to charge them with the adult crime. So generally, any act committed by a juvenile is considered delinquent, any criminal act. Now, where some people got confused is they were talking about things like truancy, things like running away from home, smoking cigarettes, buying or drinking alcohol, all these things that are only illegal for minors or juveniles. The alcohol thing gets a little confusing in states where the legal age adult age is 18, but the drinking age is 21. There's a space there. But for a lot of other things, 18, you can then go wherever you want and you're not considered a runaway. You can decide that you want to sign yourself out of school. Those are generally what we call status offenses. So they're not usually called delinquent, they're called status offenses because they're totally legal for adults to do. So that's a difference between a delinquency and a status offense. Delinquency is a criminal act, what's normally criminal for an adult, committed by a juvenile, which of course juvenile is usually defined by someone under the age of 18. And a status offense is a violation or an act that violates a law that only applies to juveniles. All right, number 4, explain the consensus and pluralist perspectives and how do they differ. One other question you might have here is what do we have here in our society? I think our society, it kind of depends when we're just like we're talking about deviance. It depends upon the act. So consensus, the idea of consensus perspective means that pretty much everybody agrees. So in the case of murder, pretty much everybody in society agrees that murder is not appropriate, and therefore we make laws that make it illegal. That's the consensus perspective. On the other hand, with regard to the use of, let's say, marijuana or the act of people paying for sexual acts, commonly known as prostitution, some people, there's a lot of people in our society that don't believe that either of those acts is wrong, and they should not be illegal. So there's not a consensus on that. Where a pluralist perspective means you have different people in different parts of society that totally believe a different way. So let's say we have people come from other countries and other religious backgrounds and whatever that believe that if someone in the family embarrasses the family in a severe way, that they can be killed. That's called an honor killing. Generally, it has to do with, when we hear about honor killings, usually it's a young woman who gets involved in a relationship with a man outside of their ethnicity, race, religion, whatever, and the father, to bring honor back to the family, can kill the daughter. Now, in a pluralist society, you would have people that believe murder is totally wrong, people that believe it's okay, people that believe, you have all these different beliefs, and then someone has to decide what's the right or wrong. So in our society, what do we have? I think when we look at it, we have a mix where you have some issues that we have consensus on, and other issues where, maybe people in the lower socioeconomic status and middle class may believe one thing, and the people in the so-called high class or upper class believe something totally different. That's pluralist. And there's a whole nother issue when you talk about law, is, who gets to make the laws? Well, again, the legislature and Congress. But, and someone actually wrote about this in their paper, and I think your book does allude to it, is there are a group of people or theorists that believe that law is made by those in power, and it is made by those in power to protect themselves. Certainly there may be laws in that regard. I would expect that if you're going to talk about those kind of things, you probably give us some examples. Maybe later on the course, you'll have an opportunity. All right, number 5. Like I said, nobody picked number 4. But if you're not sure what this means, I would go back and read that section. But number 5, what does a criminologist do? How is their role different from a criminalist or a police officer? So they throw these in here to make sure that people don't get confused by the different terminology. So if you read through the text, it talked about these things. If you went through the PowerPoint slides, it kind of breaks it down a little bit. But a criminologist is someone who studies crime and criminals. And with the basic idea is trying to figure out the why behind, why do we have crime? Why do people commit crime? And it's not, as some people suggested, it's not that we're trying to figure out why a certain individual, if they committed a crime. If they committed a crime is something that's done by the criminal investigators, who are usually police officers. But criminologists are looking for the why. And that could be on an individual level. If we're looking at someone who is committing a crime because of some psychological disorder, some major biological issue, or something else, we can look in a case study kind of format and look at an individual, and we can look at how they were raised. Where did they go to school? What kind of neighborhood were they in? Did they have any physical or biological issues or psychological issues that would have impacted whether or not they committed a crime or not? That's criminologists on a individual level. But many criminologists are not looking at individuals. They're looking at a global perspective and trying to figure out what are the causes of crime. And there's a whole lot of theories out there, as you will know from looking through the text and through the conduct of the course. We're going to be looking at a lot of those. The first chapter kind of alludes to many of them. Criminology was for many years very well steeped in sociology. Matter of fact, one student said that criminology is a subset of or criminology is a subset of sociology. I would really debate that point at this point. Criminology is really an interdisciplinary field where we have people from anthropology, biology, psychology, psychiatry, medicine, sociology, of course, and a variety of different fields, because what we found is there are a whole lot of different things that add up or interact to create crime. So if you look at it from a sociological perspective and you said, well, crime is caused by poverty. Well, think about that for a moment. How ridiculous is that statement all by itself? And some of you may be living in a neighborhood that is in poverty. Are you a criminal? Are the majority of your neighbors criminals? Probably not, because what we also find, and this criminologists study this, is that in society where there is crime, crime is committed by a very, very small subset of the community. So even in a society where there's poverty, where maybe there's underperforming schools, where there's a lot of unemployment, the majority of the people are not committing crimes. So you cannot by itself say that poverty causes crime. So what we know now is there's a whole combination of issues. Some things that prevent people from committing crimes, whether that's, good parenting, good role models, whatever. There's a whole lot of different factors. And it's you can't just pick one thing and say, "Oh yeah, that's the cause." You can't even look like in Philadelphia with their plan that they came out with several years ago to fight crime. Said, "Oh, these are the root causes of crime." Certainly contributory and I just mentioned they're basically sociological: poverty, unemployment, underperforming schools, all those different things, neighborhoods that are in decline are all considered contributory, but some people call them the root causes that, these things cause crime. But if you look at crime more deeply, you'll find that there's plenty of crime in societies that don't have those issues. There's people that commit crime, all over the place. There's guys when I was a police officer, there were people that committed burglary all over my community that came from the same type of community that was, generally a middle class community, and they were, doing fairly well, but they chose to make their money by breaking into people's houses. So you don't always have crime based upon poverty. So, criminologists study that stuff. Criminalist, as a lot of people identify, think about criminalist, think about the term crime scene technician, forensic scientist, if you will. There's a bunch of different roles as far as what a criminalist is, but a criminalist is basically that person who is working in the field of investigation of crime. They're the person that's either out in the field collecting the evidence, processing that evidence within a crime lab somewhere, and doing that type of different thing. So if you watch any series involving investigation of crime on TV, if you've ever watched NCIS, which is something my wife got me watching years ago, there was a criminalist, if you will, Abby Shudo. She knew everything about everything, which of course is not the reality in criminalists. You have specialists for the most part, but she knew ballistics, she knew fingerprints, she knew computers. She could find out any information about any piece of evidence that you brought her in a heartbeat. And then she left to go on to something else in her life, and they brought in another girl who does basically the same thing, not at the same level, I don't think, but that's TV. But because it gives you like a composite of what a criminalist is. I also, because it was playing on Lifetime, just watched almost the entire series of something I'd never seen before, and it actually started in 2010 and ran until like 2016. It was a show called Rizzoli and Isles. It was set in Boston. Rizzoli was a female police detective who was in the homicide unit. Isles was a medical examiner who also ran the forensic lab in this particular station of the Boston Police Department. And certainly, if you're a cop and you're listening to this, you know that TV kinds to throw a lot of things together. So there's a lot of things that are not real, certainly in the Boston Police Department or any police department for that matter. And like when I was in college, I did a seminar course where I worked part-time at the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. There was no police station anywhere near the medical examiner's office, and we hardly ever talked to cops unless we went out on a scene. But in Rizzoli and Isles, the medical examiner's office is actually in the police station. The crime lab is in the police station. The medical examiner, Isles, is like best friends with the homicide cop. And she too, not only does she do examination of bodies, deceased persons, but she also processes all kinds of evidence. And this woman was brilliant. But that's a criminalist. A criminalist is somebody who's working with the stuff that gets found at the crime scene, and is brought back to somebody. And criminalists work, in local crime labs. Philadelphia has its own forensic crime lab. It takes up an entire building, and they have a whole wealth of people that work there. And they're not like the TV experts that know everything about everything. No, you have somebody who knows about bullets, ballistics experts. You have somebody who might be a fingerprint examiner, DNA people. And of course, there's also DNA labs at the state level, which is, I believe, that's where most of the DNA labs are in Pennsylvania, at the state level, and there's some private ones as well. But those are criminalists. A police officer, on the other hand, is generally a term that's used for someone who's a sworn law enforcement officer whose job it is to investigate those crimes. Or, there's a whole lot of other things we know that police officers do. One of the things that we did as police officers in my community is we carried these lockout tools, Slim Jims, if you will. And if some person locked their keys in their car, we had to go out and help them get into their car. Wasn't fighting crime, wasn't protecting the community, it was just helping somebody. That's something that is part of community service in some police agencies. But for the most part, police officers are expected to keep the community safe, and that is done by apprehending the people that commit crimes and doing things that tend to prevent crime, like routine patrol, helping people figuring out how to best protect their properties. There's a whole lot of different things. But part of that apprehending is the investigation. But criminologists generally, and someone said, criminologists might go to a crime scene. Criminologists generally are not involved in the investigation of crimes. That's very rare that a criminologist, although they could be brought in as experts to testify in a criminal case, if someone is an expert in a certain type of crime, they might be brought in for advice. But it's not likely that the homicide detective is going to get out in a crime scene and say, "Oh, this looks a little fishy, and I'm not sure about this. I think I'm going to call, Professor Ratcliffe over at Temple University and ask him if he's going to come out here and take a look at this." Although Ratcliffe does do a lot of stuff with the Philadelphia police and doing his research, he's probably not going to get called to a crime scene unless he's out there doing research, because he was actually most recently doing some research with the SEPTA Transit Police. On a special project he's working on. So he might actually be out there. But as far as criminal investigations, criminologists aren't generally involved in that. Now, does that mean, and somebody said that police officers were criminologists. Well, that's also not going to be true. Unless, of course, that police officer decides to, get advanced education, get the degree, and starts to study crime while they're also a cop. That's possible. I mean, that's what I'm doing right now. I spent 25 years as a police officer. I spent the last 11 years in higher education. I am presently working on my PhD. I am reading a lot of literature and planning to do my dissertation by doing research in a specific part of the criminal justice system. All right, so number 6, when we talked about a criminologist, we also kind of talked about number 6. What is criminology? What do criminologists study? And how does criminology cooperate with other disciplines to prevent or solve crimes? That's an interesting one. So criminology, again, is the study of crime and the causes of crime and criminals. That's what they study. But it's a big interdisciplinary field because crime can be related to a whole lot of different things that go on in society, that go on in the individual. So there's a whole lot of different stuff. So criminologists study the gamut that's related to those things. There might be a criminologist out there that, and this is something that I wanted to do some research on, who is studying whether body cameras, a police body camera, would change the behavior of witnesses in a criminal case. Would they be more or less inclined to talk to the officer if they were wearing a camera? So, and I think there's like one study that actually did that. My people for my dissertation said I wouldn't really be able to do that study, so they won't let me do it. But Eventually, I probably will do it later on after I get my PhD. And that's something, that's like, you might say, well, they're not actually studying crime. Well, they're studying human behavior that might become a crime by seeing if there's ways to prevent crime. So do body cameras prevent crime might be the basic question. Do putting up fences around a property keep burglars out? Does lighting protect people from burglars? If we had in a certain community 499 homicides, what was going on in that community that caused that crime? And there's research out there being done right now, because there was a dramatic spike in shootings and homicides pretty much all over the country. And those of us that live in the Delaware Valley know that Philadelphia, 499, dramatic increase since the previous years, even going all the way back to 2007. So why did that happen? Well, criminologists are going to look at that. So to go look at the question of how does criminology cooperate with other disciplines to prevent and solve crimes? Well, as I said, criminology really is interdisciplinary. So you have interaction between, psychiatrists and biologists and anthropologists and people studying general crime all over the place. And how do they prevent crimes? Well, I think the main way that these people are going to prevent crimes is by, in their research, if they can find something that would suggest, well, this tends to lead to more crime. So then policymakers could take that information and say, okay, if children who are out of school and have no activity going on between, say, the hours of 2 and 7 p.m., that leads to more crime happening during those hours. And we have multiple criminological studies that suggest that that's true. Maybe we could try another study, but a more practical study where we start some type of community center, stuff like that draws in these kids after school and gets them active in positive activities that might lead to lesser crime during that time. So that's one example. There are tons and tons of examples, but criminology, through the study of crime and its causes, sometimes comes up with answers that might suggest, hey, this is one thing that leads to crime. Like in a few weeks, we're going to be looking at different psychological and psychiatric issues. There's a professor over at the University of Pennsylvania by the name of Dr. Adrian Rain. His title is both psychiatrist and criminologist. So he teaches and does research in psychiatry and criminology, because his work ties the fields of psychology and criminology together, because he looks at things that in the body, in the brain, that predispose some people to committing crimes. And his research, and he has a book, which I don't have in a room with me because I was actually using it for an assignment for myself last night. But it's called, oh no, I'm having a brain cramp. I don't remember the name of it. But he came up with a book which talks about, it's called Anatomy of Violence. The main title is Anatomy of Violence, and it's like the biological connection to crime or something like that. Came out in 2013. And he looks at some biological issues like lesser activity in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, lower resting heart rate, higher testosterone levels, a bunch of different things that is often found in people that commit crimes. Now, what he did in his book, which was really great, is he was able to look at people who had these features and who committed crime, but he also found people that had these features who didn't commit crime. And he looked at what other things were going on, whether it was sociological, environmental, whatever, that there were some people that committed crime and others that didn't. So that's another, the overlap about cooperating with other disciplines. He's a perfect example of cooperating with other disciplines, is looking at the sociological aspects and the psychiatric aspects and how they interact that might lead to crime. So, some very important stuff. So I think generally is if criminologists can figure out issues that might cause or lead to crime, then policymakers and practitioners can take some of that stuff and put it into practice to help reduce crime. All right, next one, theoretical criminology and general theory. All right, theoretical criminology is basically when somebody is doing research on a topic and they develop a theory. So someone develops a theory that lack of lighting increases the likelihood that a property will be burglarized. That's a theory. And they develop a hypothesis from that, and then maybe they do some research. So theoretical criminology is doing that work where they come up with a theory that tells us that based upon this particular theory is why we cause crime, why crime exists. So I can give better examples when I get past the general theory part. So what is general theory? General theory is when someone postulates a theory that says this is the reason why there's crime. We talked earlier about poverty. Somebody could have a theory, well, poverty is what causes crime. Without poverty, we don't have crime. Well, of course, we all know that that's bogus. Well, Gottfriedson and Hershey in 1990 published a book called General Theory of Crime. And I'm sure it's cited in your textbook. Look it up, take a look, see what it says. But basically, they said that crime was caused by low self-control, that people who committed crimes were unable to control their wants, desires, and they just went and they committed crimes. And that's their theory. And now there have been a lot of follow-up studies that really validated their theory and said, yeah, low self-control is definitely a cause of crime. But they suggested that low self-control was caused only by environmental or sociological factors. And later on, researchers suggested that there might also be some biological factors, which Gottfriedson and Hershey completely dismissed the possibility. But now there's research to suggest, well, yeah, maybe that's possible. And Rain is one of those people, along with many, many others. So general theory just means that a person's coming out with a theory and says, well, this is the cause of crime. And if you look through your book, many of the theories, if you take them by themselves, are what we would call general theories. If somebody is trying to say that this is what causes crime, period, that's a general theory. All right. Last question. What are the two major systems that track crime in the United States? How are they different? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And what is the dark figure of crime? Well, this is an awesome question. Some people, I think only like one or two people actually answered this particular question. And there was a little bit of confusion between the two systems and what they do and how they collect data, et cetera. So there is a link that you can look at for better explanations that may be better than the book with more detail about each of them. But the two major systems are, number one, the UCR, which is run by the FBI, and more recently something called NIBRS, or NIBRS, depending on how you pronounce it, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. That's one, which collects data on crimes that are reported to the police. So the UCR or NIBRS is collecting data on crimes that are reported to the police. So if you go out, and if you have a car, and you go out to the car in the morning and you find that somebody got into your car and threw all your stuff on the floor, and you say, well, I got to get to work and I'm not reporting this, that's not going to be counted in the UCR. If you walk out of your house in the morning and somebody scrawled some derogatory remark on your front door in spray paint, and you just decide to wash it off or remove it and don't report it, that also is not going to make it to the UCR. So that's one thing. Murder is almost always reported because it's hard to kill somebody, unless you put the body in some place that nobody will ever find it. Even that, when somebody's missing for a period of time, Usually authorities will determine that based upon other evidence that a murder has taken place. So murder is probably the most reported crime in our society. Same thing with stolen motor vehicles, because somebody takes your car, you're more than likely going to report it unless you stole it from somebody else. So those are really high ones. But say a theft, vandalism, on smaller scales, a lot of times they don't get reported. A lot of times sexual assaults don't get reported, whether it's because of embarrassment, shame, fear, or intimidation. There's a whole laundry list of reasons why people do not commit crimes. Against a lot of crimes, it might be that intimidation factor, that afraid to be targeted if you rat on somebody, if you will. Although I don't consider that a proper term. If somebody's a victim of a crime and they report it, they're not ratting on somebody. I don't even like that term at all, because if somebody's doing crime, they deserve to get reported on. So UCR and NIBRS, that's one side. The other one is something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS. That is run by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It is actually carried out by the Bureau of the Census, because they have the practical ability to carry it out for the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So how does that work? Well, they're not counting actual crimes. And someone confused this, said, oh, they collect data in the same way. No, the NCVS is doing a survey. So they do thousands of people every year. I don't recall exactly what the number is, but they survey thousands of people every year. And usually it's going to be a phone call. They call you up. I need to ask you some questions about, crime. And they survey people that are 12 and older, and only in a residential setting. So they're not calling up businesses in the NCVS to survey people. They're calling up residential people in the thousands. And they ask them a variety of questions about crime. And of course, one crime that they don't ask about is murder, because if you're a victim of murder, they can't talk to you, right? So the NCVS doesn't have data about murder. They only have data about crimes that living people could answer questions about. And of course, they don't have information about crimes that occurred against businesses, because they're calling people at home. So they don't really address murder, and they don't address, commercial robbery, theft, whatever, burglary. They're only addressing, personal crimes, crimes at residences, those kinds of things. So there in and of itself is a difference, because the UCR tracks a whole laundry list of crimes that are reported to the police, while the NCVS is only talking about crimes in a residential setting, personal crimes to individuals, and they're also only talking to people 12 and above. So they're not counting in the NCVS any crime that has occurred against children between the ages of 1 and 11. So those are the basic differences. And UCR is collecting data on every crime that's reported. NCVS is only collecting data on crimes that living people can talk about. They have to be 12 and above, and it's in a residential setting. So, those are major differences. But each has advantages and disadvantages. So one thing, and it goes to the last question, a dark figure of crime, one thing is we know that every crime is not reported. So if every crime is not reported, then the UCR is certainly not accurate. The UCR does not tell us about every single crime that occurred. And that's something that is being discussed right now with COVID. COVID, let's say in the city of Philadelphia, they said that pretty much every type of crime in the city of Philadelphia, except for shootings and homicides, dropped. And it's the same things being reported in cities all over the country. Well, why is that? Well, think first of all that the dropped comes from crime that was reported. So we could pretty much be sure that there are some crimes that are not being reported. One of them, ones that child welfare people are very concerned about, is the possibility that child abuse is not being reported, because now children, generally child abuse is done by people that you know, a lot of times your own family, acquaintances of the family, whatever. So now the child is in lockdown with the family and not going to school where, a teacher or someone else could maybe see bruises or see behavior, or the kid could talk to somebody, report it. A lot of those crimes, it's feared that a lot of cases of child abuse are not being reported during these COVID lockdowns. So that's one example. So, that is certainly an issue with the UCR, is we only know what people tell us happened, and that's certainly a disadvantage. So that's what the dark figure of crime is. The dark figure of crime are those crimes that happened, but we don't know about because nobody reported them. So that's definitely a disadvantage of the UCR, is we don't know about everything. The other thing that was a disadvantage of the UCR, which is being changed under NIBRS, is the UCR had what was called a hierarchical system, where they only counted the most serious crime in a single criminal episode. So think about some of those commercials for the burglar alarm companies, where, like the one where there's a woman who's in like a glassed patio or something, and she gets on her treadmill in her her tight workout costume, and there's a guy out in the bushes watching, knowing that she's home alone, and then they allude to the possibility that he's going to break in the house. Well, if he's out there and he's watching this woman home alone, and he knows she's there and she's home alone, what's the likelihood that he only wants to go in the house to steal stuff? Probably not much. The implication is that he's also going to assault this woman, probably a sexual assault. There might be, another physical assault. If he has to hit her or beat her or whatever to get her to submit to his sexual desires. He's got to break into the house, and if he assaults her hard enough, maybe he kills her. So you got a homicide going on. And if he takes anything with him, you got a burglary and a theft. So you have a laundry list of crimes, but under the UCR, only one of those crimes would be listed. That would be the murder, if he killed her. If he broke into the house and he committed a rape or sexual assault, maybe the rape or sexual assault would be the highest one listed. So if you looked at the summary of the offenses that occurred, you would only see that one offense. So you could say, well, there were this many criminal activities, but we don't know all the crimes that occurred. The NIBRS system, and the National Incident-Based Reporting System, that is replacing the basic UCR and is supposed to finally be implemented fully in 2022, I believe. And you can look, there's videos on it and stuff on the FBI.gov website about the implementation of NIBRS. And that will track everything. You'll be able to know how many different crimes, because it's tracking the incidents, not the crimes. So you'll know in that incident, the 6 or 7 different crimes that were committed during that incident. You'll know what the method was that he got used to get into the house, whether there was a weapon involved. All these things in the National Incident-Based Reporting System are going to be, all this data is going to be collected. The neat thing about that, NIBRS, is that data then helps in the area of research, because then researchers can go look at that data and they can find out a whole lot of different things about crime. And let's say they look at, okay, there was all these incidents and where there was a burglary. Well, what time did they occur? How did they get into the house? And they can theorize on, what's the most likely way the burglary occurs, and then how can we prevent it, as we talked about in a prior question. So UCR has its issues. NIBRS is supposed to correct some of those issues. What about NCVS? Well, NCVS was created in the 70s, and you can go look at the website from the link that's in your module. And it was created to try to determine what we were missing. So we identified, and researchers identified, that there was a dark figure. There were crimes that we didn't know about. So we wanted to try to figure out how much crime really is there. So the NCVS was created to survey people across the country in doing a scientific survey using a random sample of people that is spread upon across different types of people across the country, that we could then take that data and hypothesize that, okay, if 50% of the people that we talked to reported they had some type of criminal involvement, then more than likely 50% of the people in the United States were involved in some type of crime as a victim. So what they could do with that then is say, all right, so the data from the UCR tells us that this percentage of people are victims of crime, while extrapolating the data from the NCVS shows us that it's much higher. Matter of fact, the NCVS, it's suggested that the NCVS tells us that crime that occurs in our society is at least twice as much as that is reported. So that's a great advantage of the NCVS, is it gives us a better picture of what's going on in our society. And they have a lot of different data tables based upon all the questions that they ask. And you really got to look at the website to see it. Disadvantages, kind of already addressed them. They're only talking to people 12 and above. So they're not getting anything on crimes against children. They're only talking to people in residential environments. So they're not counting like the UCR does, commercial burglaries, robbery of the 7-Eleven, NCVS is not counting any of that. So it's missing stuff in its counting. So I think that basically concludes my overview of your week 1 assignment questions. If there's anything that you're still grappling with understanding, I would strongly suggest you go back into the textbook and read the section that applies to this area. And certainly you can reach out to me and ask me for a question, or we can have an online conference and chat about it, or, come to our next meeting on Monday night and you can ask that question. Incidentally, hopefully everybody listened to this and you're listening to the end, but I'll announce this elsewhere. Next Wednesday at 7 p.m. in my introduction to criminal justice class, we will be having a special guest speaker, Kristen Inciardi from our Pierce College Library, and she'll be talking about the use of library resources and doing research and APA. I will provide you with a link to that meeting should you desire to attend. I will also give anyone who comes to that meeting the same consideration that you get for coming to the Monday meeting. We won't talk about anything in our class at that Wednesday night meeting, because it'll just be Kristen, and then when she's done, I will be starting or finishing up with my intro students. But if you come to that meeting, I will give you credit for the discussions in week 3 and mark you present for attending the synchronous session in week 3. All right, so if you have any questions, I'm going to cut this off now. They tell me they should only be 15 minutes, but covering all 8 questions, it didn't quite work out. So let me stop recording. Thank you very much for visiting with me, and have a wonderful evening.